Hi. So following on from the previous conversation, actually, my name's Rhyddian. I work for Citi, head of supply chain security there, and also run our open source program office. Going to do a little bit. There was the talk in the earlier talk. There was the mention of supply chain security. Been doing supply chain security a little while now, and the longer you do it, the more you realise how massive it is and how little you actually do know. So in this 15-minute lightning talk, we're not going to cover all of it, anywhere close to it. We're probably not even going to scratch the surface. But there is a key point that I wanted to talk about today. So as we all saw with the 2-year-long XZ utils compromise, cyber attacks are becoming increasingly sophisticated, and the threat actors are highly motivated. The 2023 IBM cost of data breach report found the average cost of a single data breach was nearly $4.5 million. It's a lot of money. And Gartner suggested that by 2025, 45% of organizations will have suffered a supply chain attack worldwide. It's a big concern. So it's a major endeavour, and as I said, we're not going to cover it in 15 minutes, but there's one aspect that I'd like to talk about. So supply chain security, it's about ensuring and verifying the authenticity of the software that's running in your organisation, in your production environments, even if that software contains known vulnerabilities. So what's supply chain security about if vulnerabilities are allowed? So ensuring vulnerabilities are known, eliminated and mitigated is a critical part of your cyber defence operations. But vulnerable software may contain flaws or defects that could be exploitable in your environment, and that's a key piece. So whilst they could be used to launch a supply chain security attack, they're not in themselves a supply chain compromise. Software has bugs, it has vulnerabilities. That's not what a supply chain compromise is about. The supply chain attack occurs when malicious code is intentionally added to what might be legitimate software dependencies, and it uses the supply chain of those dependencies to propagate the malicious code to its targets. So supply chain compromise is about malicious code entering your supply chain. Vulnerabilities could be used as a way of getting in malicious code, and it's important to make this distinction. So they might be acceptable. Vulnerabilities might be acceptable in your environment. You may not be using a particular function which is vulnerable. You may be deploying it in a way which it's not actually exploitable. And like many of you, almost certainly, we've got rules about how quickly vulnerability must be mitigated, depending on the severity of the vulnerability. However, for malicious packages, zero tolerance. The package has to be immediately removed from our build systems, production and non-production environments, and that's immediate, zero tolerance. But what about production stability? So it's true that removal does take some time. It's got to go through the build, test, deploy processes, especially where there's transitive dependencies that are being removed. But the point is that remediation has to start immediately. Zero tolerance of malicious code. Even for packages that don't actually appear to contain malicious code. So we've seen typo squatting attacks, which is when a package similarly named to a legitimate package is entered into the ecosystem. They've got a similar name, and they might not initially have any malicious code in it. The aim is to infiltrate the supply chain and become adopted, and they wait for it to become part of the supply chain before later injecting malicious code. So the point here is that it might not actually contain some malicious software, but it's not the software you think it is. So it might not actually even behave in the way that you expect it to. But even if it doesn't contain actual malicious code, it's not the software you think it is. So it has to be eliminated, which is why there's zero tolerance. And that's a key thing. Malicious packages, they're not the same as vulnerable packages. Now I'm going to make an assumption that you all know that the vast majority of the code that runs in your organization has not been written by you. probably 80% or more by some measures, and probably most of it's open source. So do you really know what's running in your environments? I mean, your developers probably know, or at least they have some idea, hopefully, of their immediate dependencies. But as an organization, especially where you get transitive dependencies, maybe hundreds of transitive dependencies, do you know who wrote it? Do you know how old it is? Does it have vulnerabilities that could be exploitable in the way that you're using it? And it is not just those immediate dependencies, it's those transitive dependencies as well. Because the things that you really need to worry about from a supply chain perspective come from your dependencies. It's not the software that you're writing. And that's both open source dependencies and vendor software. The 2017 NotPetya attack, that's probably one of the most well-known examples of a malicious supply chain attack. It's probably also the biggest. It caused $10 billion estimated total damages. Big companies like Maersk and FedEx were affected by it. And it all started with an attacker injecting malware into an accounting package, MEDoc. So the attacker compromised the supply chain of a vendor dependency, which was then distributed to all their customers around the world. Now, if upwards of 80% of the software that's running in your organization comes from third parties, where do you think attackers are going to spend their time? It's probably not going to be in your software. So, and put simply, if an organization is not verifying your software supply chain, then you're probably running code in production, which is not the code you think it is. I'm sure you're all very familiar with what a software supply chain looks like, a modern software supply chain. Don't worry about zooming in on it. So on the left here, we've got, these are your third-party dependencies, vendor software, open source dependencies. In the middle is your developer tooling and your build tooling, and then over on the right-hand side, you've got your deployment infrastructure and production environments and the lot. And then, see it flash in the middle there? I'm sure you've all got that little piece as well. This is the gateway for managing the ingestion of your third-party dependencies. Everybody's got that piece, right? Now, a while ago, John Meadows, who's head of cloud security at Citi, analysed, he's probably got far too much time on his hands, 7 years of supply chain attack information. He analysed it and he mapped it onto the SDLC. It's not an exact science. It's heavily skewed towards open source because that's where a lot of the data is. Obviously, supply chain attacks on vendors is not so much publicly available. But it gives a very good idea of the direction of where this stuff comes from. The data is very interesting, even though it's not entirely scientific. So over the past 7 years, 45% of supply chain attacks occurred in open source dependencies. 43% occurred in third-party vendor supply chains. Now, between them, that's nearly 90% of supply chain attacks occurred in dependencies. What's really interesting about that, if you look at that 37%, so nearly 40% of supply chains attack occurred through malware being introduced into vendor source code. So the security of your vendor environments, the people that you're depending on. So the primary exploitation mechanism for open source seems to be, from the data, malicious software being created in the first instance. So an attacker provides malicious code and then either passes it off as legitimate or manages to attach it to an existing channel where it can be legitimately distributed and perhaps even signed. And so with this data, it's hopefully clear that the most crucial aspect of securing the supply chain is investing in the ingestion process for open source and third-party dependencies, so stopping the software before it hits your developer tool chains and making sure that it's the software that you think it is. So the first step is to identify all the ways that the software is coming into your organization. As well as your blessed paths, I'm sure you're running all binary repositories and you're bringing in open source into your build tool chains and those sorts of things. the software's probably coming in a lot of other places. People downloading binaries from vendor websites or Git clone from GitHub where there's binary packages not created. So there's going to be it's going to be multiple like unknown or unauthorized mechanisms which you need to identify and control. So key to this is identifying and then controlling the ingestion points in your organization. You've got to know how software is coming in first before you can control it. So as we discussed, you've got way more dependencies coming into your organization than you're building. So invest in having a policy. Policy's critical. You've got to put your company policies behind this, say what's allowed and what's not allowed. And then validate those software dependencies before they enter your development toolchain. Various ways you can do this. So for open source software, there's tools such as OpenSSF's secure scorecard, which shows the security level of projects. That's a particularly good resource. For malware itself, malicious packages OSV database that OpenSSF run is also a good resource. And of course, there's an array of commercial security vendors ready to help you identify malware on ingestion. But as I said, the key is identifying it before it hits your developer toolchain. For vendor software, your existing vendor sourcing processes will likely involve a bunch of diligence checks on the company, make sure it's good standing and all those sorts of things, and it's certainly a good place to start. Something to consider is following the US government's lead and asking vendors to provide machine-readable SBOMs, software bill of materials, for each release. Now, the interesting thing about that is whether you use the information from the SBOM or not, the fact that a vendor can provide an SBOM regularly with each release is a really good indicator of their supply chain maturity. But if you do use it, then you can use the information, and in particular comparing deltas between SBOM releases will give you insight into malware potentially entering your vendor's supply chain, not just using things like the malware databases, but it allows you to check the open source that they're using, and you can check against those packages, see if it was, typically with a malware injection, it's a big dump of code once, rather than over a long period of time, lots and lots and lots of commits. So if you use the information, then you can start to identify whether your vendor's dependencies have been compromised as well. And then finally, you need to keep an accurate record of all your software dependencies. I think we all kind of know this, and where they're being used, so where they've been deployed. So think about, if you're deploying onto EKS, like these software dependencies are going to be bound up in those deployments. It might be a bit more difficult to find. So building into your tool chains the ability to identify where dependencies are being used. As I mentioned earlier, unpatched vulnerabilities is certainly an attack vector for threat actors to inject malware. Remembering 37% of supply chain attacks occurred in third-party vendor source code. So having significant unpatched open source dependencies revealed in the SBOM information is a data point around the veracity of a vendor's source code. But an accurate inventory is essential to manage your software patching, definitely, perhaps especially so for vendors providing software to their customers. But either way, when you find vulnerabilities and malware, it's essential that you identify where they're being used very, very quickly. So for malware in particular, while you're waiting for an app team to deploy an update, which could take days whilst you've got malware in, you need to know not just where it's deployed, but you need to understand what that malware is. So you need to know how it behaves. You're going to be having to launch some immediate threat response to that. So, for example, if it downloads payloads from an S3 bucket, you're going to want to block access to the proxies to S3 buckets. It might be uploading SSH keys. So again, you might want to be blocking those URLs. So those types of activities. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, supply chain security is highly complex. As I said, the more that I spend time on it, the less I seem to know, and are always finding new attack vectors. But it's major, and it's a necessary part of modern software development, as we saw earlier. So if you only take away one thing from today, because it's such a big topic, I hope that it's to focus the investment on the ingestion mechanism for third-party software dependencies. If you've got $1 to spend it on open source ingestion. If you've got $2, spend the other one on vendor ingestion. Because the things that you really need to worry about from a supply chain perspective come from your dependencies, which is why nearly 90% of supply chain attacks focus their efforts on them. And that's it. Any questions?
Just interested, one of the things we're looking at Simon Holt and Jake Norman, we're interested in trying to bring code in and automatically drop it into an environment where you can look at the signature of how that software is running, and then on the next release look at how the signature's changed and see if you can do some sort of analysis on that to go, that wasn't what we expected.
So you're talking about legitimate software, you're talking about to detect tampering?
It's trying to detect, it's a bit like Aqua, when you mentioned
Yep.
the Docker image, you can
Yep.
put it apart and go, well, I expected this, and all of a sudden there's 4 ports appeared. Where did they come from? And it wasn't what we coded.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where doing that analysis on the open source that's in it, finding URLs that are against like the C2 banned list, for example, doing that analysis. There's definitely vendor tools that can provide that, and there's open source tools that can provide that stuff. I mentioned things like the OpenSSF's OSV database, package URL and a hash. You'll identify malware really quickly in an automated fashion and block it before it hits your tool chains, long before it gets into those Docker images.
Come up against, isn't it, of course, that you're seen as delaying the CI/CD release, and then you're sort of trying to push back on that to say, well, it's worth that delay.
Yeah, it is. But with the system that we've implemented at Citi, it takes up to a day, but typically the vast majority, because the vast majority of the software coming into the bank, I mean, we see probably half a dozen packages, malicious packages a month coming in. Like, it's not a massive amount when you consider we're seeing 30,000 packages coming in over the same of legitimate stuff, but it is there. As long as the 30,000 aren't particularly impacted, a delay of a couple of hours or whatever is okay. The developer experience isn't great for the first developer going through that process because it's going to break their build, but they forge the path for everybody else. But if it's, as I said, this is why it's super important to get policy involved in this. And have that policy. We all have policies around vulnerabilities today. Like, you can't have CVE 9s in there. You can have CVE 6s for up to a month or whatever it is. But malicious, there's no tolerance for whatever. Because most importantly, it's not the software you think it is. So yeah, as long as policy is the key piece there. Is making it acceptable that you block the builds.
Is more vulnerable than those source vendor dependencies?
Well, what was showing, actually, they're not far off 50-50. What we're showing is the data, so the analysis, and the difficulty with, as I mentioned, with that data is that open source information on open source is very available, it's very public. Vendor compromise is less so. Which is why it's important to think about getting things like SBOMs from your vendors, because it starts to show you their levels of maturity and whether they're, if they've got a whole bunch of CV, like mandatory CV 9s in there, you've got to start worrying about their supply chain. And believe me, some of the very, very big software providers, the very big global software providers, they're not great. Like, there's problems. Cool. Thank you very much.